Good evening, everyone. You're going to see a little questionnaire pop up here, just a couple things to fill out. We're going to get started in just 1 minute as people trickle in. And for those of you just coming in, you're going to see a little pop-up poll. If you don't mind just filling that out, and we're going to get started shortly. I'm going to slowly get the ball rolling here. This presentation is scheduled for 1 hour. I don't think it'll take quite that long, but I'm going to leave some time for questions at the end, regardless. My name is Tal Kitron with Appleroot Tutoring. I'm an elite tutor and executive function coach. I've been with the company since, about 2013. And today we're just going to talk about the ACT in its current form, a little bit about the changes, but just kind of get to know the test itself, talk strategy, and then, as I mentioned, open it up for some questions as they may come up. So our 3 things we're really going to cover. Number 1 is the format. So that means the timing, the section, the structure, and then content and major strategies for each of those 4 sections. And as I mentioned, the changes that are coming / already being made. So most of this is going to be spent on the English, math, reading, science breakdown, and just kind of give some insight from what I've noticed about what the test writers tend to do and various tips and tricks that will help you game the system a little bit. So let's start with the scoring. Unlike the SAT, which is out of 1600, and that's a perfect score, a perfect ACT is a 36. You can't get lower than an 8, so you get 2 points just for showing up on each section. But each section has a possible 36 points, and then they are all averaged to get a composite score. So if you added, the 4 scores and you got a 33.25, that's a composite score of a 33. But if they add up to 33.5, we round up. So 33.5 is actually a composite score of 34. And it is always in this order. The ACT is a very fast-paced test. Part of the reason that they are changing it later this year and next year. But for April and June and July and the tests that are coming up, this is what you can expect. So a paper test starting with English that is 45 minutes, 5 passages of 15 questions apiece. So that's 75 total questions, 45 minutes. Even though that's a lot, people don't tend to struggle for time on this section that much relative to others because a lot of the questions are quick, easy, simple, grammar stuff. Math, on the other hand, 60 minutes for 60 questions is rough. And we'll talk about how it gets more difficult as it goes. But got to think about like prioritizing the first 30 or 40, always getting those. And then many people will have to guess on some questions towards the end, but you can be strategic about it. And then there's a 10-minute break between math and reading. The reading and science sections are the last 2, and they're incredibly fast-paced. 40 questions in 35 minutes. So for reading, that's 4 passages, 10 questions apiece, and you get less than 9 minutes per passage. And then science is 6 passages, and so you always have to spend 5 or 6 minutes for 6 or 7 questions. Very tough. Total of a little over 3 hours of testing time. So a lot of my students have extended time, right? If you have an IEP or have a floor plan in school and you have time and a half, that's great, right? That means I have time to finish these sections, but it can be tough on ACT because then we're all of a sudden there for nearly 5 hours. And if our extra time is for ADHD or lack of focus, right, or processing, it can be tough, right? Maybe being there for 5 hours is actually a detriment. So again, another probably reason why the ACT is shortening the test right down the road. Right now, it's a long test, very fast paced, and that is the one thing that people tend to find fault with on this test. but the material itself is generally easier than the SAT. So that's the bright side. Simpler, more straightforward, no old passages, etc. So what does the ACT actually test? I mean, there's tons of overlap with SAT, as you'd expect. These are both college entrance exams graded on a curve to standardize scores across the nation and the world. You're going to see grammar. That'll be on section 1. Section 2 has math from arithmetic to algebra to geometry, trig, and even pre-calc stuff on ACT, which would not come up on SAT. Reading comprehension, of course, especially in section 3, but also throughout. You need to actively read each section for math and science too. And then vocab, not as much as SAT, but they do test it. And finally, on the science section in particular, but really throughout, you're going to do graph reading and data interpretation. So that's X and Y axis and the title and the key and using answer choices to your full advantage. So before we dig into each individual section and some questions, overall strategies that apply to the whole test. Number 1 would be take practice tests. Practice your pacing with timing drills. That could be sets of questions, entire sections, and eventually entire mock tests. On every section, make sure you're answering what the question is asking. Since we've got the hard copy test booklet, you want to be actively reading and always make sure you're circling things with your pencil, right? If you're solving for 3x, then make sure you know that because you're going to at some point get X and want to circle that answer. Rule number 2, keep it simple. There's almost always a simple solution. Like on math, it may seem super complex, wordy, but then you think about it, it's like, oh, they're just asking me for the area of a triangle. I know that formula. And then don't leave any answers blank. So there's no guessing penalty, no points off for wrong answers. So you'd never want to leave anything blank, and they're all multiple choice, but it's not a regular test where you need to get like 90%. You just need to do better than the people around you. It's all on a curve. So skip around, get as many easy points as you can. That's something that's hard for people to embrace, right? Because we're on a question, we're close, we feel like we're going to get it. It's hard to convince yourself to just move on. But you're better off missing a math question in 30 seconds than getting it right in 3 minutes, which is counterintuitive. So let's start with English, section 1. The first thing you'll always see on the ACT. A little over half the questions are grammar. And grammar is all about, does it sound right? Trust your ear. Rhetorical skills, so rhetoric, is more about, does it flow well? Is it on topic? Does it flow smoothly? So not having to do with grammar for those questions. Step 1 is going to be just differentiating between those two broader types. Average time per question is 36 seconds, but some will be quicker and some will be longer. Just the nature of the game. On grammar questions like this, when you see A, no change, and then 3 choices, those answer choices are everything. So on section 1, you go straight to the answers. These are verbs, right? And this tells you, all right, they're testing either a verb tense or maybe subject-verb agreement. And if you get to really be an expert on ACT or SAT, you'll identify glide as a plural word, they glide, versus it glides. That's a sign from the test writer. So just giving those 2 answers as options is then saying, number 1, this is not verb tense, this is subject-verb agreement. Number 2, subject is probably either way before the verb, or maybe we're doing verb before subject, something weird. Either way, one of these is right, glide or glides, pretty much always. Here, I'm looking at what is gliding or who is gliding, and it's not the mountaintops, it's the eagle, singular. It glide? No. It were gliding? No. It glides. C is our answer. But again, once you get really good at this, you barely need the passage. You can just look at the answers to say, hey, verbs, and this relationship means it's about plural versus singular. So here are a few examples. I'll just leave these up for a moment for people to try. Your job is look at the right side first, and then go back into the passage and eliminate the worst answers. So I'll just leave this up for a moment. I could spend a long time on English strategy, but for the first question, I'm looking at choice A, simply because semicolons are like periods. So on this test, they're functionally identical pretty much always, meaning it's got to separate two full sentences. And in this case, like it doesn't. Circular patterns made of sand is not a full sentence. So the next best bet is D, because a colon must follow an independent clause. That's a rule. Colons must always come after a full sentence, and they're a drum roll, they introduce. So for choice D, in 1995, divers off the coast of Japan discovered a surprise on the seafloor, colon, drum roll please, what was it? Circular patterns made of sand. That's a good answer. And then for number 2, this is all commas. When that happens, you want to test answers without as many commas. But if I'm looking at choice B, these circles were often over 7 feet in diameter and contain concentric rings and ridges, making them appear. It's breathless. It's not all one idea. So it's not B, but it's also not C or D because of the first word and the commas. Our answer for number 2 should have been A. These circles were often over 7 feet in diameter and contain concentric rings and ridges, comma, new idea, making them appear much like a target or landing pad. And then finally for number 3, this is kind of a neat trick. B and D are identical. Again, pretty much every time on the ACT, if you see a period and a semicolon, but nothing else has changed around them, they're both wrong. So then it's just a matter of, is it a dash or a comma? And this would be a fine place for a comma, a half stop, just separating ideas. Elimination is the key, as is using the answer choices to identify what is being tested. Right, and so for grammar, that's all it. These are all clauses and punctuation questions, but sometimes you'll see verbs or pronouns or possession stuff, and you'll know, the writers are testing me on this now. For rhetoric, on the other hand, so you're going to see several grammar questions, passage on the left, questions on the right, and then all of a sudden number 4 is going to be, at this point, the writer is considering adding the following statement. And our job is going to be answer yes or no, and why. As you see on the left side, for these, you should first decide yes or no. You would say yes if it stays on topic and it flows. So if you looked at the context for whatever this passage is, and you said, well, yeah, there were changes and they were good, then it flows, it's on topic, it's a good answer. Whereas if you looked at it and think, dang, this was better without this sentence. If I took it out, it's actually better as is, then we'd say no. Again, only add a statement if it stays on topic and it flows or transitions smoothly, objectively. Try not to bring your own personal bias in or like, I wouldn't write it like this, and more be a robot. Is it terrible? Then it's a no. Is it decently on topic? Then it's probably a yes. These rhetoric questions take a little bit longer than grammar, but down the road, they can be the easiest questions on the test because they're very much robotically, you've got a task to accomplish. That being said, for these and for connector questions, we will need more context than you would for just a period or semicolon question. Here's a rhetorical skills example that we can just try. For this one, we start down here. At the underlined point, the writer would like to provide specific information about her brother's hobbies. That's our job. So for accomplish a task questions, they're called that because we have a task to accomplish. This is boilerplate language. Given that all the choices are true, which one best accomplishes this purpose? So that'll be always repeated. So we just need an answer that provides specific information about her brother's hobbies. No changes, things I find very boring or games I like. Maybe. B is like a slam dunk better answer. His favorite activities, whether it be playing with Legos or designing complex Lincoln Log masterpieces. I mean, that's specific info about the hobbies. And what they're saying is that this would replace the underlying portion. I test C and D, we always want to like eliminate and be careful, but it's obviously B because that's the most specific answer and it mentions the brother's hobbies. So no doubt on this one. And we can be not like math where you can be sure there's a right answer, but here it's the least wrong. And also you can be fairly methodical and almost mathematical to get to an answer that you can almost prove. So final tips and tricks for section 1 is first realize if it's an A, no change, and like a bunch of grammar, like short answers, then it's a grammar question. So we like short answers are better. Trust your ear generally. Versus the rhetoric questions, oh, I've got a job to do. What's my job? Be a robot and make sure it flows and stays on topic. Of the 75 questions, treasure each as if they're worth 1 point, because it probably is at a very high level. If you go like 70 out of 75 correct, you're probably still only getting like a 32 or a 31 out of 36, just because there will be some people who get a perfect 75 out of 75. So treasure each question as if it's worth a point, because it very well might be. And that's English. And this is the section that is easiest to improve. So if you take a mock, a lot of people take their baseline test and get like a 20 on ACT English. But if you just practice it and understand the test and can get to the point where you finish it, we can get that up, in tutoring from a 20 to a 30 a lot of times, just by virtue of understanding what the test is, how the writers are testing topics. All right, doing well on time. Let's talk about math. 60 minutes, 60 questions. Time per question, 1 minute, although that will average out differently because the first 20 questions are easy. The next 20 are medium. The next 20 are hard with certain amounts of overlap. It is a grab bag. I always tell people the SAT is know a lot about a little. Got to nail the algebra. The ACT is just know a little bit about a lot, right? They'll go from a logarithm to a matrix to vectors to geometry. And just if you remember it, great. And if you don't, we could be in trouble. They do test geometry more than the SAT, but do not provide formulas. So you got to memorize stuff like area of a rectangle and triangle and circumference and area. You don't get a built-in Desmos calculator, but you are allowed your own calculator the whole time. And the other weird thing about math is in all 60 questions, there are 5 multiple choice answers. So you can see A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, J, K, which is obnoxious. All that means for us is if you are working backwards with the answers, you probably want to start with the middle one, right? Because then I could know, for example, if I tried this and it didn't work, I would usually know if I need to go up or down to a bigger or smaller number. But that's kind of neither here nor there. That's a bit minor. The biggest takeaway from this page is just understanding that there's a whole bunch of different stuff on the ACT math, and you need to prioritize early points, but also then later the questions that are easier for you. And that might be, hey, I'm in calculus and this question makes sense, whereas an easier question that you learned years ago might not. Again, the general rule is math gets harder as the section progresses. That being said, you will sometimes students are like, man, I really understand these questions late because I've been doing asymptotes and parabolas in school. But if I see a question about a logarithm or exponent or root or geometry or trig early on, I might be lost without prep. It is algebra heavy, unlike SAT, which is 70%, the ACT is more closer to 50. More geometry heavy. Arithmetic are the hardest questions because they're just random stuff about wordy situations, but it could also be percentages and ratios and proportions and just things that people haven't thought about or really don't prep for in school because it's not tested that much. And then quite a bit of trig, sine, cosine, tangent, even some unit circle stuff. So got to have a very well-rounded math background to get everything. But remember, the goal is really just get as many easy points as you can in 60 minutes. So what's our strategy on this section? Rule number 1, always, what am I solving for? Circle it, write it down, right? No reason to lose points because you solve for the wrong thing, but it happens all the time. Translate word problems into equations. So translate words into numbers, right? Always writing out. Sometimes that means using the answers or picking our own numbers. Write out your work. So don't skip steps, but also use your calculator to double check. And then within reason, check your answer. But again, 60 questions, 60 minutes, we don't have that much time. So it's more like a logic thing. If you've got a degree that looks like this and your answer was 190, that wouldn't make much sense. So you might be able to say, wait a second, that's not 190 degrees, that's less than 90. Here's what a couple math questions would look like. Noticing even just in these two, the wide spectrum of topics that is covered. So for 29, you'd have to remember SOHCAHTOA. And if you do, you're golden. Tangent TOA is opposite over adjacent. So the tangent of an angle, small angle A up top, can be rewritten as capital A over capital B because that's the opposite side over the adjacent side. If we've learned that in school and remember it, wonderful. And if not, we need to knock rust off. And then it's not a hard question, just got to do the review. 30 is tough because people are like, wait, irrational, what does that mean? And what it means is just anything that isn't rational. So like a pi would be irrational, or root 7, an imperfect square. Here, f and j are both rational numbers. So for number 30, 4 and then 2 root 4, which is 4, are rational. So those cannot be the answers right away. And then I'd probably just plug in, right? So like, for example, for g, if I plugged in 2 root 2 for b, that means the absolute value of 2 root 2 squared minus 24 minus 8 equals 0. And we just have to double check that. 2 squared is 4 times root 2 squared is 2. So that's 8 minus 24 minus 8. And like this would be negative 16, which becomes positive 16 minus 8. That does not equal 0. So that is not our answer. So then we try H, which is the correct answer. 4 root 2 in for B, carefully putting that in and squaring it and finishing out, writing out the whole question. This time, 4 squared is 16 times root 2 squared is 16 times 2. 32 minus 24 is indeed 8, and the absolute value of 8 is 8, and 8 minus 8 is 0, which is what we want. So A and H, but I think for a lot of people, these will be hard questions because, hey, I've forgotten it. I've learned it, but it's been a while. Right, but these are classic examples from the middle of an ACT math section. Here's another. Circle we're solving for is the first move. And in this case, we're being asked for the height of a right triangle. Unless you see a root 3 or a root 2 or a 30, 60, 90 or a 45, 45, 90, just assume it's a normal right triangle, and we'll use Pythagoras. That is something the SAT provides, the ACT does not, but I would say most of my students know it. Pythagoras is leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. So our C has to be the 26. So 24 squared plus something squared equals 26 squared. Then it's just easy math. Calculate. I would put it in my calculator probably. 576 plus b squared equals 676. Subtract 576 from both sides and then square root. And we'll get that b is 10. That's our final answer. If you recognize this as a 5, 12, 13 multiple, great. That's pretty high level. Not necessary, but helpful. Because Pythagoras works, we don't necessarily need that though. And yeah, 10 looks like a good answer here, so we feel fine with that. Here's a probability example. So this last one was geometry. Here we've got probability. A bag contains 9 macadamias, 13 cashews, 18 peanuts. How many additional cashews must be added so that the probability of randomly drawing a cashew is 2 out of 5? The most common mistake I see people make is they'll use the answers, which is smart, but they'll only add it to the number of cashews, not to the denominator. So here, this is a kind of complex pro tip, veteran pro tip. When you're being asked a question like this with changing probability, it is better to focus on what is not changing. So because I'm adding cashews, but macadamias and peanuts are staying constant, we focus on those to figure out, well, if I have 2/5 cashews, that's 3/5 of the others. That's tough, right? So if that doesn't totally click, that's okay. But knowing that macadamias plus peanuts is 27, our job is to figure out, okay, so 27 out of what would be 3/5? Because then that final total would be our final total. We just figure out how many cashews we added. 27 is to X as 3 is to 5. If you were to write that with the cashews, this is why it would be hard. It would be the cashews, which is 13 plus X over the total, which right now is 40. But that's also going to be plus X, because whatever you add here, you have to add to the total. And so that could equal 2/5. This is solvable, but not preferable. Our last step, once you've got the fraction, is just cross multiply and then understand what you solved for, which was 45 is the final total of all the nuts. Then we can just subtract our 27 macadamias and peanuts to get 18 cashews, meaning we need to add 5 cashews total. So final answer here is B. Oops. But just understand that this is a much harder question than some of the others we saw. So like if you saw 30 geometry, 31 this, right? Focus on this question. Make sure you nail that. And if we miss this, oh well, right? Mark it for review, come back if you have time, go get easier points if you're stuck. Math, final tips and tricks before we move into the last 2 sections. Always show your work, definitely use your calculator, skip no steps, do no mental math. Prioritize easier questions, which are the early ones, but also certain later questions that just fit your sensibilities. More than okay not to get to every question. Most people will not. Very few people get to all 60, even the best test takers. But don't leave anything blank. My recommendation is bubble in the last 2 letters, E and K, straight down the line if you're running out of time. The reason behind that is you don't want to Christmas tree it, which means like goes left, right, and just kind of different answers for each. If you do that, you're likely to miss every single question. If you bubble in E or K and just go straight down the line, you're likely to at least get a few right, just mathematically, probability-wise. Before a test, I'd recommend reviewing basic geometry, so angles and triangles, and then trigonometry rules. Same with stats like mean, median, and mode. They will provide scratch paper. You bring the pencils, always draw shapes, right? Even if they provide it, sometimes I'll redraw it. And if you get stuck, use the answer choices to maybe work backwards if they're friendly. So if you've got like a 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, use those. Whereas if it's X and X over 2 and X squared, maybe we're plugging in our own numbers. So remember that it's okay to get stuck. It's going to happen to everyone. Just don't spin your tires and spend forever trying to get something. Move on, come back later if you have time. So that's math. Let's talk about reading. One of the harder section scores to boost, to be honest, but it's all about pacing. 35 minutes for 40 questions. That means you have 8 minutes and 45 seconds to read a passage and do 10 questions. 8 minutes and 45 seconds to read a passage, a whole passage, and do the 10 associated questions. That averages to less than a minute per question, but again, some questions will be relatively quick and others will take a bit longer. If you ever take more than about a minute and a half on a question, it's too long. If, however, our scores, we're not aiming for a 36, we're aiming for like a 30. That's when you consider maybe I don't do all 4 passages. I just try 3 of them, nail them, and then guess on the last one. We'll talk a bit more about that here. So studying for the ACT is a marathon, not a sprint, but the ACT itself is a bit of a sprint. If we are going for all 4 passages and a perfect score, you get 8 minutes and 45 seconds on average per passage. However, let's say we're realizing I'm not getting to all these passages. I'm always getting to the last one with 2 minutes left. I have to guess. I'm rushing on my 3rd passage. Maybe you're better off just trying to get 3, nail them, right? So do passages 1, 2, and 4. And then for passage 3, we just guess straight down the line. And honestly, if we're scoring more in like the teens or lower 20s, maybe you start by prioritizing only 2 passages, right? So the maximum there that we can nail is 20 points, but if you guess on the rest of the way, you're probably going to get another several. All right, so this is all about how much time do I have? You got to practice with pacing and think about how much time to spend on questions and passage, but some people just aren't going to get to all 4, and that is okay. Always coming in this order. Number 1, literature. So prose and fiction, an excerpt of a longer literary work. Some people really like this and find it interesting. You still may not want to do it first, just because it can tend to take longer, and that might cost us later on. The second passage is more fact-based, social science. Third is a little bit more like the first one, so humanities, so a little bit more artsy or about a person or some sort of movement. And the fourth one is very sciencey, so true science, very fact-based. Passages 2 and 4 I equate because you can really use the same strategy for both. And throughout, it's an open book test. The hard part is, like, if I miss something in the passage, or if I see a question and I don't know where it was, going back and forth can take up too much time. So reading questions, reading answers, and in this case, like choice F talks about 100,000 stars, so I can go look at that number and see if that sentence matches. I still think process elimination is key, but once in a while you just look at an answer and say, oh yeah, I remember seeing that. Right, so you'll have the passage in the booklet, then you have the questions, and just a decent amount of flipping back and forth. I tend to, especially starting on reading, I do everything in the test booklet. So like the actual like test itself, and then copy down into the Scantron sheet after each passage. Some people like to just go in order and just go like, I'm doing question 1 in the book and I bubble in, 2 in the book and I bubble in. That's fine too, right? Just figure out if that distracts you and takes too much time, maybe adjust. The common questions you will see. How is the passage, like what is the structure of this passage? And then you'll see like 4 choices that give you possible answers. What's the point of view from which the passage is told? More commonly, what is the main idea of the passage, or what is the main idea of paragraph 5? And then specific detail where it says, as used in line 7, the word also most nearly means what? And so you need context and then test the answers. One of those 4 passages, so again, literature, social science, humanities, natural science, always in that order. One passage will be a comparison, which means it's going to be passage A and B. So you might flip to passage 2, social science, and realize, oh, this is 2 passages. Deal with them in order. So instead of reading both and having all that in your mind, read passage A and then do the first few questions which relate only to passage A. Then read passage B and do the rest. That's just to keep less in your working memory at one time, make your mind work less hard. And because the first several questions are always just passage A, it makes a lot of sense. You don't want to have passage B clouding your judgment yet. So the final tips and tricks for reading, active reading is the biggest thing. And what I mean by that is underlining, circling, starring, but especially taking notes, especially on passages 2 and 4, because those lend themselves to a very fast read, almost just hunting for clues. I take like a minute or 2 to read those passages, and just say, okay, there's the introduction, here's the hypothesis, here are the findings, here's the takeaways for the future. And then my notes are a little outline where I can refer back to the passage, which I will do on the questions. But yeah, making little stars and just keeping your pencil moving. Passive reading is kind of starts like this, and then it goes to that, and it becomes this, at which point we're in trouble. So you do not have to go in order, passages 1 through 4. You can strategically skip questions or whole passages to preserve time, energy, confidence, momentum, which I think is absolutely key at this stage of the test. Think of the test writers, not good answers, but what are the throwaway words? What are the words this writer put in to make these answers wrong? And if you can find the 3 bad answers, hey, we're at the right one. And then correct answers are more often sparrows, not peacocks. Meaning on reading, we like vague, nothing answers that says, scientists may have a solution for the future, versus scientists have developed a sweeping answer to all of our problems. That's a peacock, flashy answer, too specific. We like something that's sparrow that we can't argue with, that just doesn't say a whole lot. That's better. So if you're ever down to 2 choices, pick the sparrow, pick the non-flashy one, even if you feel like it doesn't say a whole lot. That's usually a good thing. All right, we're doing well. Final section, science. This is the one that really, I hated it. When I grew up in Illinois, and it was an ACT state. You had to take the ACT, and I liked it. I was fine. And then I took the science section. I was like, what the heck is this? And I didn't do well. And I've had many students who especially start that way because we're ready for actual science, but it's not that. And we can't even, like, it's way too fast paced for it to be really scientific thought. 35 minutes, 40 questions, just like reading. And so we just don't have time to read the experiments and dig into the graphs. We go straight to the questions and choices and match back to graphs. To demystify this section and make it a little bit more approachable, stay on the surface. That's number 1. Do not get bogged down by the words in the passages. The graphs are much more important, and much of the information, if not most, is unnecessary and never tested. So people will look at it and say, oh, I remember doing this in science class, but that's actually not a good thing. That's just going to distract you and take time away, right? And maybe even lead you in the wrong direction. And then the other rule is just look at the questions and choices. So every question, we look at the question, the answers, and then match those to the graphs. A lot of times that's all you need. If there's no match, then we need to do more work. But the first rule is we got to be fast paced, stay on the surface, match answers to graphs. And again, it's science, but it's like, it could be anything. So this is about dirt. But the takeaway is I don't care about any of the actual science usually. I just want to know what are the relationships here. Well, it looks like as water content goes up, or I guess silt and clay have more water than sand. It makes sense, right? But that's the relationship there. There's 2 direct relationships and 1 inverse, and they might ask me about that. Or it could be clouds. And here the relationship as is the more cosmic ray flux there is, whatever the heck that is, the greater the percentage of low cloud cover. I don't need to understand anything more than that, right? There might be a few outside knowledge questions, but even for those, you can usually finagle your way to an answer just by using common sense, right? Think like a 6th grade scientist, not a rocket scientist. So a lot of this is going to be graphs, looking for trends, and then takeaways, right? So this 3rd dash would just be like an X and Y axis. And then the harder questions would be scientific method. So if they asked you about independent or dependent variables or a control, right? Or how would you set up this? How would you change this setup if you were doing the project? But some of those are easy. If they said, how did the experiments differ? Go straight to experiment 2, and it'll probably say, we repeated experiment 1, except we used a different brand of fertilizer. So understanding that the science section is not really science, it is vast majority of the time going to be interpreting graphs and matching. If you don't get a match, that's when you have to use common sense or context and think like a scientist. The hardest part about science, though, is it's so fast paced and it's the end where we're kind of burnt out. And so people kind of they see it and they're like, wow, what is going on here? They don't realize they can simply answer most of the questions. Here's one practice question for us to try. So I'm going to ask if each question is worth the same amount of points, and the answer is yes on the ACT. On the ACT, everything's worth the same, which is why you want to prioritize the easy questions. So here our job is at which of the following surface temperatures, that's the x-axis, would the luminosity of a star in galaxy B be closest to 2 times the luminosity of a star in galaxy B with a surface temperature of 3000. So let's first find that. I'm assuming that RL is luminosity. On the real test, if you weren't certain, you would go back, and I'm sure they define it. RL is relative luminosity. So that's the context we would need. The question is, looking at these answers, when are we double that? 2 times the luminosity. So let's start with 3100. For galaxy B, 3100 is right there. That's not double. So it is not F. 3300 is right here. That's closer. It might actually be my answer because it's pretty close to 2, right? It's not quite there, but it's close. So definitely keeping that. Compare that to 3500, which is quite a bit too high, and 3800, choice D, which is even higher. So our answer here is going to have to be H. Ooh, they say G. I mean G. That's what I meant, because that's the 3300, right? And so, like, if you draw a line straight up from 3300, it's not at 2, but it's pretty close. So that is closest to double. And again, you just can't, like, it's hard to feel amazing about that. So you pick your answer, you move on, and we're going to see 39 more of those. Only one more today, though. 23 says the data in this figure best support which of the following hypotheses. As the surface temperature increases, so I see that as the x-axis, as the surface temperature increases, the average size does what? And it's not a constant rate, but it never goes down, it never goes flat. So it's B. You might ask yourself, are there really questions that are that easy? The answer is absolutely yes. We just got to find those and get them right. All right, home stretch. So final tips and tricks for science. There is one of the 6 passages that is different. So most of them are just graph, experiment, questions. But there will be one of the 6 passages that is like a reading section, reading passage. You'll have scientist 1, scientist 2, scientist 3, or like student 1, student 2. For those, you want to just treat it like reading. Actively read the question, actively read the passage for dueling scientists, and like mark up each scientist's opinion. So like that is very different because the other ones were doing this process. Actively read the question and choices. This is for a normal science passage. Match the choices to the graphs. If there isn't a match, look at context. And then finally, if there's still no match, we're already, we've been there for a minute, we got to move on. So just use basic common sense and think like a 6th grade scientist. What's the most simple explanation that not only I can see, but others objectively could find the same clues? And so now I just wanted to talk about the changes, just so you guys are aware. For most people, let's say you're a junior right now, this may not affect you much at all because the ACT, and we'll talk about how it's changing, but it is becoming a different test. It's becoming shorter on every section. So you get more time per question. And there's going to be a digital option for a lot of people, although the paper test is still like the default. And they're also, we'll talk about the science section. So like first in April, so that's next month. For only digital ACTs, meaning let's say you have a school day test and there's a test center and everyone's taking on the computer. I've had a few students who have had this, like the pilot program. Unless you have heard that you're taking a digital ACT, this does not apply to you for April, and it won't apply to a vast majority of us. However, in September of this year, the ACT national and international dates, so like that's September, that's October, that's December, science drops out of the composite 36, so it is no longer part of the score. It is optional. We're going to talk about that a little bit, but the science section that a lot of people hate is going to become optional later this year. And so that'll be like a 36 on its own, and it remains to be seen how colleges will deal with that, whereas English, math, reading will get you your ACT score. Finally, then in spring of next year, all the like in-school and state and district testing will shift to that new shorter ACT. So at that point, it'll all be the shorter version and not what we've talked about all day today, but of course, tons of similarities. So check out the difference. I mean, this is significant. Current ACT is 215 questions and you only get 175 minutes. The enhanced ACT is a tiny bit shorter, noticing that without science, it's a lot shorter. And you have 44 fewer questions. So that's the biggest change, is all the sections are shorter and you have more time per question. Right? I guess I shouldn't say all of them are shorter because it does look like the reading has stayed the same and science is longer, but remembering that the science section will be optional. So much, much more time per question and then fewer questions for most sections. And then the current ACT time versus new ACT time per question, and then the increases. So a total of a 22% increase in time per question. Really great. Definitely a good move, much needed, because the ACT has always been so fast paced that it's been somewhat obnoxious. If you opt into science, of course, they're going to get their money out of it, $4. The science section is getting less speedy, like we saw, but it's still kind of long, 45 minutes. Not sure how colleges are going to handle. We'll know more probably even in a few months, but it's a standalone score. And maybe, you know, for Georgia Tech or like a STEM school, some students might still want to showcase their science skills that could still add to your portfolio, make you a more attractive applicant. And so that might be a reason to take the ACT science. And a lot of people will just decide, no, I'm not taking that. And then finally, the content changes. So like besides the actual question, you know, shortening of time, the types. So the length of the English passages are going to be a little bit varied. Right now, they're all long. Now there'll be some shorter ones like SAT. There's going to be new essay with questions related to that. I think we'll probably get examples of that in the coming months. There's like a practice ACT they're releasing in April. They're really cutting it close. No longer will you have A, B, C, D, E, and then F, G, H, J, K. Hooray. Only 4 multiple choice on math, not 5. Fewer questions on the calculus-y stuff. Fewer time-intensive questions in context. So more math, less words. And then fewer questions in the integrating essential skills. So that would mean not the most basic stuff either. So a lot of algebra is my understanding. And then for reading, again, the length of passages will now vary. So it won't all be the long passages. More integration of knowledge and ideas questions, and then more diverse perspectives, which they already do a good job of. And finally, science, at least one passage will have engineering and design, which for me, I would have hated in high school, but some STEM people will love that. And there is going to be more outside knowledge. So a harder section because it's optional and really mostly for STEM people who are wanting to show off, you know, their chops. And experimental questions will be embedded. So they used to do this thing with the section 5, which everyone knew wasn't real. And so it was silly because like we're taking this section 5 for data for future tests, but everyone kind of knew, wait a second, this doesn't count. So now like SAT, they've put the experimental sections within or questions. You don't have to worry about this. Just know that some of the questions won't count because they're just gathering data for future tests, but they will count to your official score. And again, we'll know more as ACT reveals more details, which they have been sparing with. Last two slides. The test information release, which is now offered in February, September, and December. If you take an official ACT in those dates, do make sure you get this. It's been renamed to My Answer Key, but absolutely need to get this. It's really, really helpful. It's now called My Answer Key. And so what you'll do, this is just on the official ACT page, but you'll scroll down, view product catalog, and order the My Answer Key for those tests. Again, it's only February, September, and December. But it gives you the multiple choice test questions, the whole booklet, your answers, copy of the answer key, and the scoring table. So that way, like with a tutor or on your own, you can go back through the questions you missed. It's the single best way to prepare for your next test. No essays. I mean, the ACT essay is like really pretty much gone. As of a couple of years ago, these were the schools that required it. So West Point, the only one I'd actually heard of. There are some schools that still recommend the essay, but honestly, it's pretty much gone to just your college application, personal statements. So I haven't really recommended ACT essay for anyone in quite some time. So some questions, when should I start? A lot of people, spring semester of junior year. I mean, I think at latest probably. If you're a very high scorer, you may want to do summer before junior year because maybe you're looking at PSAT, SAT. The biggest thing is decide first, right? So take a practice SAT and ACT and figure out which one do I like better. Game plan from there with test dates. Students often ask me, what is a good score? Impossible to answer. A good score is a score that makes you competitive. It depends on where you start, where you want to be. But this is a test of effort, not intelligence. You can improve just by working hard and getting repetition. And then as far as college applications, when that comes to it, should you send all your test results? It depends. I mean, there are a few Ivy League schools that make you do that, but most colleges super score, which means you just send what makes you look good. They'll only look at the highest section scores across multiple tests. So if you take, the test in June and get an English 32 and a math 20, but then you take it in July and you get an English 29 and a math 25, they'll only see the 32 and 25, only the highest scores. And that is, most colleges do that. And this is what that would look like. So like if you see, for example, Kennesaw State, this is the range for ACT. So half of the students accepted were between 21 and 24. If I'm at a 23, I'm thinking, okay, I'm in the range. I might want to get a little bit better to give myself a better shot, but I certainly could apply with that score. Right, and so that's what makes a good score depending on where you want to end up. It takes most students 3 official tests to reach full potential. There's no wrong time to test, and you have plenty of practice at this. Even for early action stuff, if you take a test in like September, October, you can still get that score on those applications, even if sometimes October a tiny bit late. But you can supplement an application with that. But 3 official tests generally. And no college has a preference between ACT and SAT. So that's a myth. There's nobody that's going to say we prefer SAT scores or ACT scores, which means you as a student should prep to your strength. What are you better at? What do you like more? That's the test you take. Once in a blue moon, people have to switch from ACT to SAT, but you don't want to. You want to work on just one test if you can. And I just want to emphasize, like, I know it's mostly students here, so this is not a test of intelligence. There are like arguably 8 types of intelligence. This test may be 2 of them. This also does not measure your effectiveness and ability as a person. This is a test of running into the right test on the right day, being prepared for what to expect, and grabbing as many points as you can so that you're placed nicely on the curve compared to people next to you. That's it, right? So work hard, understand the test, repetition, and you will improve. I guarantee that. That's it. So I'm going to open up for Q&A. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take those. If you are comfortable, you feel like you got what you needed, feel free to call it an evening, and thank you for joining. But yeah, just going to open it up for questions here. Okay, a couple good ones. So the first one is, can I still get a 36 without science in September? The answer is yeah. So you can, if you take the test in September and you decide not to opt into science, then the other three sections are what would average out. So to get a 36, you would need to get a perfect score and then a 35 and a 35, for example. I wonder if that would still get you a 36. I think you would need two 36s and a 35. But yes, in September, the science is optional. The composite score will just be based on English, math, and reading. So yes, you can still get a perfect 36. Next, what letter is best to pick when low on time? There's a myth that C is often like correct more often than others. I never bought into that. The biggest thing is if you run out of time and you've got 10 questions, go straight down the line. C, 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 or D, 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 D. Don't Christmas tree it. I do believe that on math, the best answers are the last two, E and K. I just find them right more often than not. Next is, does it look bad if you don't do the essay for top schools? No, I mean, no. The top schools don't require it, don't really consider it at all. Work on your personal statement, get your high composite score. No, I haven't recommended an ACT essay in a long time. A couple other good questions here. So this one, which test has science? Not sure. You might have to clarify that, but like the ACT has a science section until September. The SAT does not have science. The ACT has a science section, which is mostly about graphs, and that will be going away in September. It will become optional and different. Next question is a really interesting one. Which test is better for autistic students? I work with a lot of students who have LDs and accommodations and extra time. In a lot of ways, it's the ACT because it's such a fast-paced test, but it's simpler. And so in some ways, that's a better move. But it really, I don't want to paint with a broad brush because different students, wherever you're at on the autism spectrum, have different personalities and feelings about the tests. So I would say, instead of saying which test is better, try them both. You'll know based on the scores and or how you feel about them, which one you like. And so I think I'd recommend that to anyone, not necessarily just someone with autism. Next one's a great question. What resources do I recommend to study for ACT? I mean, I'm biased, but Appleruth has a really good book, this big white and red book, which if you get like tutoring, you definitely get this, but you can also, I believe, order it through the website. It breaks it down really nicely. There's 2 full tests in there. That's number one, because ACT, unlike SAT, does not have a bunch of practice resources for free online. As the test changes, they probably will add some. But yeah, I mean, I think the Appleruth test, there's also a few free tests online. Right now, that's the best bet, the Appleruth book. Thank you guys for the nice messages. I appreciate you joining. Last question I see here is, what can we do during the 10-minute break? Which is really a wonderful question because we want to recharge. I'd bring a snack, I'd bring water. I would get up, I'd go to the bathroom during that 10-minute break. I would do neck rolls. I'd probably like close my eyes a bit and just make sure that I am resting my brain, stretching my legs, and staying alert. And as far as proctors go, the question is, do the proctors give you time updates? Yes, but I would not rely on a proctor. I would bring either my own, like you can bring up, there's ACT watches you can bring, or rely on the clock that's up on the wall. But proctors have a history of like, just, I don't know, messing things up slightly. So yes, proctors should give you updates, but they're not going to say like 30 minutes left, 20 minutes left. At best, they'll say like 5. So you're better off kind of trusting yourself and checking your own time. There is one more, which is, do I think it's better to wait until September? I'm recommending to a lot of my students to, like, if it's even, do SAT because it's going to be more consistent. It's hard to know. I think the new ACT test is going to be a good one, but it's just going to be really hard until we see it. So I wouldn't wait until September. I would definitely see which test you like better. And either way, get one under your belt, 1 or 2 before the change, depending on what year you are in school. All right. Thank you guys for joining. That's all we've got for tonight. Have a wonderful evening.